This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome or welcome back to our conference on the pursuit of happiness in interreligious perspective. For those of you here for the first time, my name is John Witte. I'm director of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion here at Emory University, the host of our conference. Yesterday, many of us had the privilege of hearing two wonderful interfaith dialogues about the understanding of happiness, how it's to be pursued responsibly, what are some of the impediments to its pursuit, what are some of the institutional responsibilities that attach to its pursuit, what does it mean to have a right to the pursuit of happiness? Does it mean merely the freedom to pursue it unhindered, or does it also mean the welfare right, the set of supports that institutional structures, including the state and religious communities, offer a person in the pursuit of happiness? And how do each of us that have been given the freedom and the privilege and the gift of pursuing happiness, how do we share that gift with others? Those are amongst some of the issues that are already on the table in a robust interfaith dialogue hosted by His Holiness the Dalai Lama yesterday afternoon and nuanced in greater detail by 6 of our colleagues later last evening. Today we have the opportunity to hear 3 of our interlocutors that were part of His Holiness's conversation in the afternoon give us the opportunity for deeper reflection and deeper understanding of the wisdom of their respective traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We have the privilege of hearing from Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs from the United Kingdom, then from Presiding Bishop Catherine Jefferts Shorey. In the afternoon, we'll hear from Professor Saeed Nasser, and then we'll have later in the afternoon the privilege of hearing the Venerable Mathieu Ricard. Each of them will plumb some of the deep architecture of happiness understandings in their tradition, show us some of the ecology of happiness understandings in action in their traditions, and open up a deeper conversation in conversation with panelists. Each of our major speakers will give us a 50-minute address. We'll have brief responses from 2 experts, and then an opportunity for a conversation with the panel and with you in the audience. There'll be intermittent breaks so that we can continue the conversation informally. There'll be opportunities for book signings. All of those are indicated in detail in the conference program that you have when you walked in the auditorium, or you can collect on the way out. Yesterday we had a brilliant preview from Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of some of the remarks that we're going to hear, and I can't wait to hear more from him this morning. And rather than talking anymore, I'm going to turn the lectern over to my distinguished colleague and friend and a long-standing supporter of our Law and Religion Center, Professor Rabbi David Blumenthal, who will chair our proceedings this morning. Will you join me in welcoming Professor Blumenthal?
Good morning, everybody. In the early 1980s, then President James Delaney, whom we are privileged to have with us today, together with the late Professor Hal Berman and Professors Frank Alexander and John Witte, convened administration officials and faculty to form a group whose mission would be to examine in a thorough and scholarly way the relationship between religion and law. At that time, few institutions had undertaken this task. The program in Law and Religion, later the Center for the Study of Law and Religion, undertook this task in 2 major ways. First, we have offered joint degrees programs, JD, Masters of Divinity, JD, Master of Theological Studies, and JD, PhD. We have also offered courses cross-listed between not only departments but schools of the university. Second, we have organized research projects on such major themes as the child in law and religion and society, law, religion, and human rights, sex, marriage, and family in the religions of the book, religion, law, and democracy, to name a few. Each of these research projects required the designated fellows to read and work together over a period of several years and to produce papers, critiques, revisions, and eventually articles and books. Over 300 books have evolved from these research projects. Each project also concluded with a major address and an all-day symposium. You can learn more about the work of the Center for the Study of Religion and Law in the conference program, as well as on the Center's website. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the indefatigable work of John Witte himself, without whom none of this would have taken place. And while I am at it, I want to acknowledge also the help of the staff of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion. These ladies are outside tending to all the details today. If you get a chance, be sure to thank them. We are gathered here today for the symposium that caps the current project, The Pursuit of Happiness, whose director, Lyndon Reynolds, is with us today. How does one define happiness? Does anything that gratify us count as happiness? Or do only some activities qualify as giving us happiness? Law cannot answer these questions, but religion or philosophy can, or at least should. And from a practical standpoint, and here we come to law, what are the limits of the individual pursuit of happiness? How does society justly limit, and it does limit, our pursuit of happiness? The great religions and law systems of the world have much to say on this, and we are gathered here today to hear their views. The first session this morning deals, as John said, with the views of Judaism. I have only a general knowledge of what our distinguished guest will say, though I cannot imagine, Chief Rabbi, what you might do to improve your presentation of yesterday. And I have no idea at all of what my distinguished colleagues will say. So I would like to begin by sharing 3 thoughts of my own on this topic, and with them challenging our speaker and our panelists to respond. First, I find myself very ill at ease with statements like, "The purpose of life is happiness." I find myself even more ill at ease with such statements as, "Happiness is achieving inner peace," or "Happiness is contentment, and without contentment somehow one's life is not worth what it should be." Or with statements such as harmony or being right with God is the goal of life. I know that His Holiness the Dalai Lama says so, and that many people ascribe to this view, but I think it is not the normative Jewish way to see things. There is a stream of this thinking in Judaism, and it is embodied in the word noam, which means bliss or blissful being, as in Psalm 27, "Achat sha'alti me'et Adonai ota va'kesh, shifti b'veit Adonai kol yemei chayai, lachazot b'noam Adonai u'levaker b'heichalo." I have asked only one thing of the Lord, to dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to have visions of the blissful being of the Lord, and to meditate in His temple. But this bliss, these visions of bliss, are for the mystics. They are for the elite. They are not for the rest of us. For the rest of us, I think, life is work. Life is responding to the world around us. Life is struggling with God and man, as the Chief Rabbi quoted from the story of Jacob yesterday. Life is struggling to get all the children up and out of the house in the morning for school. Life is doing one's job, feeding one's family. Life is caring for one's aging parents. Life is being a meaningful part of the community. Life is study and teaching others diligently. When you have 3 children crying, who asks, "Am I happy?" And what difference would it make if one is happy or not? The children need to be cared for. It is caring, not inner peace and contentment, that counts. If caring makes us happy, great. If not, so what? We still need to care. Similarly, when a couple in marriage reaches a rocky period, and most marriages do, should one really ask, "Am I happy?" What difference does it make if one is happy or not? There are issues of children, of family, of pain, of sorrow. There is a life to be led, a life of caring for one another, even when it is difficult. And when one's parents are failing, do we ask, am I happy having to deal with this? Certainly not. Honor your father and your mother is most applicable when it is hard to do, not when or if it makes us happy. Now, for the non-mystics among us, there are moments of rapport with God. Again, as the chief rabbi put it so elegantly yesterday, there are moments of gratitude to God, and there are moments of honest confession, of forgiveness, and of getting a second chance. I think forgiveness is one of God's daily miracles, Al nisecha shebechol yom imanu, for which we thank God 3 times a day. And there are moments, as he said, of just presence, just standing with God and listening. But this is not happiness. This is the counterpoint of work. And there is Shabbat, resting and not working. Prayer, not meditation. Personal presence, and not oneness with the universal. I am unhappy with the Dalai Lama's definition of the problem and with his answer, and I am unhappy with all those who agree with him. Second, I am unhappy with any linear construction of human existence. Life is not a one-way highway that we march upon until we reach our goal. Life is not a competitive sport that one wins or loses. Life is not a product that one successfully sells enough of until one has an empire. Rather, life is like sailing a boat. If you want to sail from one point to another, you need the wind to help you. If the wind is behind you, you open your sails and you go. But if the wind is coming from the direction toward which you want to sail, you cannot proceed directly toward your goal. You cannot sail into the wind. It just can't be done. If you want to go forward into the wind, you must advance by going in one direction, then by tacking to the other, and so on. If you repeat the process enough times, you will reach where you are going. Life is like tacking a sailboat. There is a time to pursue justice vigorously, and there is a time to be compassionate and understanding. There is a time to be grateful, and there is also a time to be angry. There is a time to rejoice and to be sad, a time to build and a time to tear down, a time to sow and a time to reap. There is a time to work and a time to rest. There is a time to care and there is a time to be tough. There is even a time to hate, as well as a time to love. Life is navigating, sailing between these different tasks. Life is lived seriatim. Third, much has been said and will yet be said today on the biblical words for happiness, and I should like to add my own possible construction to that of the chief rabbis from yesterday. There are 3 words in classical Hebrew for happiness. The first 2 are Simcha and Sazon, but they mean joy, not really happiness. I think that these words refer to a particular kind of joy, the existential joy that one experiences from living in the presence of God. Simcha and Sazon, as I see it, define a semantic field that overlaps with Kedusha, holiness. The third term for happiness in biblical and rabbinic Hebrew is ashrei, osher, as was mentioned yesterday. Please allow me to bring you 3 quotations to give you a feel for this word. The first 2 are used liturgically twice a day, and they define collective happiness. Ashrei yoshvei vetecha. Happy are those who dwell in your house, they will ever praise you. Hallelujah. Ashrei ha'am shekacha lo, ashrei ha'am sh'Adonai Elohav. Happy is the people whose situation is thus. Happy is the people whose God is the Lord. The third quotation is not used liturgically, and it defines individual happiness. Ashrei kol yirei Adonai ha'olech b'drachav. Happy is the person who has an ongoing fear of the Lord, who persists in walking his ways. If you eat by the sweat of your hands, you will be happy, and goodness will be yours. Your wife will be as a fruitful vine in the intimate recesses of your house. Your children will be as olive saplings around your table. I will not go into the androcentric nature of this text. That is another matter for another time. But I do want to note that happiness as defined here is not gratification of our needs, nor is it self-fulfillment in the modern understanding of these words. Rather, Ashrei connotes a life defined by labor, by work, and also by family. The semantic field of Ashrei overlaps with Derech Eretz, the moral life. And none of these terms that define biblical rabbinic happiness, Simcha, Sazon, and Ashrei, echoes the sense of the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, at least as I hear it. Nor do they resound to contentment, inner peace, and harmony. As we turn to the discussion this morning, I ask you, my colleagues, am I correct? And if not, speak up. And then answer the question, where do we go from here? The first of our three speakers is Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. You can find an extended biographical note in your program, and I will not embarrass the Chief Rabbi by repeating all the encomiums contained therein, including his having been made a life peer and member of the House of Lords. I will say, however, that I have over the years observed the Chief Rabbi in many different situations, and he has an uncanny ability at all times to know what the Lord doth require of him, but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with his God. Please join me in welcoming Lord Jonathan Sachs, Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the British Commonwealth.
Friends, David asks, am I correct? To which the answer is an unequivocal yes and no. But David, you have set us on the right path because you have told us that you're unhappy. And for a Jew to be happy is to have something to be unhappy about. If I were to sum up purely philosophically for a moment the Jewish attitude to happiness, I would say it is this. It is Max Goldberg, who in his 70s suffers a problem with his heart, is immediately rushed into the hospital that I am told is the best in the United States, Massachusetts General. He is there for 7 days. And after 7 days in this magnificent hospital, he checks himself out and goes to a very rundown Jewish hospital in New York's Lower East Side. And the doctor is just fascinated to know, why did he leave this magnificent hospital to come to this rundown place? And he says, Goldberg, tell me, Goldberg, what was the matter there? The doctors, didn't they understand your condition? And Goldberg says, the doctors, double Einsteins. About the doctors, I can't complain. Was it the nurses? Didn't they look after you? About the nurses, angels in human form. About the nurses, I can't complain. So what was it, Goldberg? The food. Didn't you like the food? Goldberg said, the food, manna from heaven. About the food, I can't complain. So Goldberg, why did you leave there and come here? And Goldberg, with a big smile, says, because here I can complain. All of this All of this leads a French contemporary scholar, Esther Ben Bassa, I think her name is, to write a book about contemporary Jewish life entitled, published earlier this year, Suffering as Identity. And it is that very negative approach to life which has dominated Jewish life in recent decades, not unsurprisingly after 2 centuries of anti-Semitism culminating in the Holocaust. But my latest book, Future Tense, actually says this is the wrong road to go down. So friends, what I'm going to do very simply is to say this. As David has, since John is here, sorry, I should say before I say anything else, if heaven is anything like the Emory University Center for Law and Religion, I will be happy in the world to come. So John, thank you for all you've done for it. It's very interesting. The first word of the book of Psalms is Ashrei, which means happy. But it's a very interesting word. There's no English equivalent because Ashrei is a plural construct. It doesn't mean happy. It means these are the happinesses of. As if in that first word, already to hint to us that there may be many forms of happiness in Judaism. And there are indeed. And I'm only going to look at 3. One, which I think David will meet you halfway, a form of happiness, or at least of existence in Judaism, that is radically different from the kind of life that we hear from the Dalai Lama. That is the first. The second will be one that is very similar to that advocated by the Dalai Lama, and the third will be one on which I believe our various traditions can converge, as it were, from different starting points. So let me begin by saying, and of course David is right, happiness is not the core concept in Judaism. We do not hold, like Aristotle, that it is that at which all things aim. In Judaism, we would sum up Judaism as life, liberty, and the pursuit of holiness, not happiness. And that, incidentally, is not an unsound way of proceeding because, as I mentioned yesterday, and as many thinkers have realized, from Aristotle to what's Mr. Flo, Mihaly, Csikszentmihalyi, yeah? Mr. Peak experiences, you do not arrive at happiness by pursuing it directly. And that is how Maimonides defines, in the 10th chapter of Hilchos Tshuva, what is ha'oved et Hashem me'ahava, somebody who serves God with love, in his fine words, oseh hamet mipnei shehu emet, he does what is right because it is right, v'sof hatova lavo, and the happiness will come. So happiness is part of Judaism, but it is not that at which we aim. Now, the first thing that is very obvious is that you read the Bible, happiness is not something you necessarily associate with the biblical heroes. The heroes of the religious imagination in Judaism. They struggle, they wrestle, they argue, they contend. They fight with the people for the sake of God. They fight with God for the sake of the people. At least 4 biblical heroes pray to God to die. Moses, Elijah, Jeremiah, and Jonah. And of course, Job likewise. The figures of the Bible know exile and know persecution, they know defeat, but they know happiness, all too rarely. Nowhere is there a more ironic word in Hebrew than the name of the first Jewish child, Isaac. The Hebrew means Yitzchak, he will laugh. And yet, Isaac's life is not full of laughter. As a child, he sees a father who is prepared to sacrifice him. As a father himself, he sees his 2 sons engage in sibling rivalry and is deceived by one of them. So, in Judaism, happiness is at the end of a long and winding road. When, in the 20th century, the late Rabbi Soloveitchik spoke of Jewish life. He spoke of it as thesis and antithesis without the mediating synthesis. When a contemporary Talmudic scholar, Adin Steinsaltz, wrote a book about Jewish life, he called it Strife of the Spirit. The Talmud says that sages have no rest, neither in this world nor the next. So I think we can say this, that there is a very, very beautiful image of happiness as being at one with the universe. But that is not the Jewish way. In Judaism, at least in the mainstream, Judaism is a religion of active engagement with the world, driven by the cognitive dissonance between the world that is and the world that ought to be. Judaism lives in that dissonance. We live in this world, but we know just how far from the ideal it is, and all our actions are intended to reduce that distance between the is and the ought. However, I want to say this, that there is a kind of happiness in all of this. Think of Abraham, the grandfather of the world's three great Abrahamic monotheism. Think of his life. He has to tear himself away from everything that makes somebody feel at home in the world. He has to leave behind his land, his birthplace, his father's house, and travel to, says God, the land which I will show you. As soon as he arrives in the land, there's a famine and he has to leave. Twice his life is in danger, and Sarah has to pretend she's his sister rather than his wife because he's afraid they'll kill him. God promises him children, as many as the stars of the sky, as the grains of sand on the seashore. He has to wait till he's an old man before he has even one child. God promises, arise, walk through the land, the length and breadth thereof, I give it all to you. And when Sarah dies, he does not have 1 square inch that he can call his own in which to bury her. And he has to pay an inflated price for the burial plot. And yet, at the end of his life, the Bible says, and Abraham died of good old age, zaken v'saver, old and satisfied with life. One of the most serene deaths in the Bible. There is a kind of happiness in all this. It is not happiness written by Johann Sebastian Bach. This is happiness at which Beethoven arrived at the very end of his life in those late string quartets. Or to take a non-musical analogy, you know, when I went to study philosophy at Cambridge, the invisible hero, he died more than a decade earlier, was Ludwig Wittgenstein. Now, Wittgenstein was a serious depressive. 3 of his siblings committed suicide. His whole life was spent in anguish and self-doubt. You know, he once said to Bertrand Russell, "Russell, tell me, am I a complete idiot or not? If I'm a complete idiot, I'll study aeronautical engineering. If I'm not, I'll study philosophy." I mean, you know, I love Bertrand Russell, you know, he was so un-Jewish, you know. Bertrand Russell once said about G.E. Moore, "I only once heard G.E. Moore tell a lie." And that's when I asked him, "Moore, have you ever told a lie?" And he said, "Yes." Sorry, okay. That's what you get by studying philosophy. Anyway, so Wittgenstein, you know, just even to think straight, has to leave Cambridge, go to a little fjord in Norway, in total isolation. This man, I actually had my room in Cambridge, just above his doctor's surgery where he died. Wittgenstein's last words were, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." Can you understand? I think one can. So that is the first kind of happiness that I associate with Judaism, which is so radically unlike, you know, the serene Buddhist happiness. It is the happiness not of being at peace in the universe, but the happiness that comes from challenge, struggle, sometimes sacrifice for high ideals, a life that has its setbacks and its moments of despair, those moments that you hear so absolutely in Moses, in Jeremiah. The point, for me as a Jew, the point in the New Testament that speaks most closely as a Jew is the last words of Jesus when he is quoting the Targum, the Aramaic translation of Psalm 22, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's a really Jewish moment. That you find God in the very act of asking, of doubting, of questioning. And there is, I think, a certain kind of, it's what Herbert Schneider once famously called sacred discontent. Anyone know of a guy called Bob Geldof who used to do this? You come across this man? Oh, sorry, you don't want the Bible according to Bob Geldof. All right, we'll move on. Anyway, so there it is. So there is, I think, fulfillment, vividness, passion in the struggle, and moments of exhilaration. You hear that exhilaration in the song the Israelites sing as they cross the Red Sea. And that is, I think, a certain kind of happiness in Judaism. Happiness is struggle. It comes in those last moments of life where you look back and you say, in the words of Rabbi Tarfon, it is not for you to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it, from having taken part in the struggle, knowing that you struggled in a noble cause. That's happiness one. There is a second kind of happiness in Judaism, and I call this the happiness of the wisdom tradition in Judaism, the happiness you find in the book of Proverbs and some of the Psalms and so on and so forth. And that kind of happiness comes closest to the kind of happiness of which the Dalai Lama speaks, and with shaded variations, the kind of happiness at which the various strands of the Greek philosophical tradition also spoke. That is a happiness of balance, of virtue, of compassion, of living well and faring well. That kind of osher is the happiness of one who is good, who does good, who has been blessed in life, and who has been held in high regard. And that is the happiness set forth for us in Psalm 1. Happy is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields fruit in its season, whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. That's happiness as rootedness. There's something very interesting in Hebrew, the word secular. Where does the word secular come from? Seculum, meaning this worldly. Would that be about right? In Hebrew, the word for secular is chol. And chol is the Hebrew for sand. Why? Because sand gets blown by the wind. You're not rooted anywhere. And that is exactly what Psalm 1 says. Loken harasha'im, the wicked aren't like the righteous. Ki im kamotza shetifenu ruach. They're like the chaff that the wind blows away. So this happiness as rootedness and a giving forth fruit and all that kind of thing. And that is the happiness of the wisdom tradition. Of course, the most remarkable account, very complex account of this kind of happiness, it is challenging and it is very subversive, is the happiness mentioned in the book, which you quoted, the book of Kohelet, of Ecclesiastes. Who is Ecclesiastes? The man who has everything. He has a wardrobe full of Armani suits, a garage full of Lamborghinis. He does the shopping in the Lamborghini. He has a second home in the south of France. You name it. What else do you have to have in order to be Ecclesiastes? And of course, as you will know, having a garage full of Lamborghinis yourself, that does not buy you happiness. And there he is saying, meaningless, everything is meaningless. And I just want to be tiny bit homiletical here, because let's do a little bit of stuff that actually works in life. I once was able to decode Ecclesiastes, because when I was a student in 1968, and for the first time I met a man who had great influence on my life, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe. And I was just about to go in to see him, and his followers told me a lovely story, which I share with you. somebody had written to the Rebbe. You know, he was a great holy man. Somebody had written to the Rebbe, I need the Rebbe's help. I am deeply depressed. I can hardly find the will to go on living. I pray and I am not moved. I fulfill the commands and yet I feel no satisfaction. I need the Rebbe's help. And the Rebbe, who used, before he was a leader of the Jewish people, ran a publishing house, and so was used to using typographical symbols, sent him the most brilliant reply, and it did not use a single word. He simply ringed the first word in every sentence. The first word in every sentence was I. If you want to know why you're miserable, because you start every sentence with the word I. And it's exactly as John said yesterday, the truth is, as Viktor Frankl always used to say, in the name of Kierkegaard, the door to happiness opens outward. You have to abandon the I and focus on the you, on the other. And if you actually look, and this gets a little bit diluted in English, but if you look at the Hebrew of the first 2 chapters of the book of Ecclesiastes, there is no other book in the Bible that uses the first person singular so much. Banitili, asitili, kanitili, each one of those is a double I. I made for myself, I bought for myself, I acquired for myself, I planted for myself. It's all for myself. And that is why he does not find happiness. And eventually, exactly as you said, David, he finds happiness in the now, in love, in work. Sweet is the sleep of a laboring man. Rejoice with the woman you've taken. In eating, he even finds a bit of Epicurean happiness in eating and drinking, and a touch of the Robin Williams in Dead Poets Society. You know, carpe diem, rejoice in your Creator in the days of your youth, etc., etc. So that is the wisdom tradition. It is the most universal. It is there in ancient Egyptian wisdom literature. It's in the whole philosophical tradition of the Greeks in different ways, in Aristotle, the Stoics, the Epicureans, and others, and almost all the great religious traditions. It comes in many shapes and sizes. Some are more this worldly, others are less this worldly, but that is the life of balance and beauty and goodness and virtue and order and inner peace, which is the exact opposite of the first kind of happiness, which is a life of struggle and passion. And that is another version of happiness in Judaism. Do not believe that there is only one way to live a good and happy life, even within a single tradition. So that's number 2. And finally, number 3, the point that I just hinted at yesterday, the point where I think we can converge whatever our tradition, and that is what I called social happiness. And it is far too little spoken about nowadays. This is a rare idea. And this comes from the concept of covenant. Social happiness comes from the concept of covenant. And covenant itself comes out of the paradox set forth with beautiful clarity in the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis. On the one hand, the human being is supremely valuable. Every one of us, regardless of color, class, culture, gender, every one of us is in the image and likeness of God. This, I think, the most single radical assertion of monotheism, as if discovering God singular and alone, humanity found the human person singular and alone. Only in monotheism do you get the birth of the individual as having ultimate significance. Set against that is, and again in Hebrew this is it's like a discord in the middle of a Mozart symphony, because we have had Genesis 1, and God saw that it was good, and God saw that it was good. And suddenly, 7 times, and suddenly in Genesis 2 we hear the words not good. The words not good only appear twice in the whole of the Pentateuch. What is not good? It is not good for man to be alone. So on the one hand, this almost infinite dignity of the human individual, but on the other hand, the inadequacy of the human individual. And out of that tension, the whole human drama as conceived by Judaism, that the whole drama is generated by that one single paradox, which to sum up what the problem is, how do we construct relationships of trust that are not relationships of dominance? How do we establish human bonds based on the recognition of the independence and integrity of the other? And that is the problem whose solution is covenant. Covenant is a moral commitment in which 2 individuals or more, each respecting the dignity and independence of the other, come together in a bond of love and trust to do together what neither can do alone. And the paradigm case of that is marriage. And the most daring, really audacious proposition of the Hebrew Bible is that the relationship between God and humanity is just that, the relationship of a marriage. It sounds sacrilegious, blasphemous. What is there that God cannot do alone? But there is, of course, one thing God cannot do alone, which is to live within the human heart. For that, he needs our partnership. And this generates a third form of happiness, which is not the struggle, form 1. It's not being at peace with yourself, form 2. This form of happiness is all about relationships. The quality and depth of our relationships with the other, with the human other, and the divine other, which is God. And the Bible sees this kind of happiness not just as a personal matter, but essential to the health of a society as a whole. In other words, a society is made by the extent to which husbands and wives, parents and children, communities, and ultimately a whole society can achieve that happiness based on relationships of mutual respect and mutual responsibility. And the Bible says something astonishing. It really is astonishing. You kind of miss it if you're not concentrating. And here it is. We have 2 passages of curses in the Mosaic books. One at the end of Leviticus chapter 26. The other towards the end of Deuteronomy 28. Terrifying, terrifying literature of curses. The one in Leviticus happens because of national apostasy. You reject me, says God. You abandon me. You treat me negligently. So I will abandon you. That's big-time national apostasy. What is remarkable about Deuteronomy is there's no apostasy. The only reason the curses happen is Tachat asher lo avadata et Hashem Elokecha b'simcha, because you did not serve God with joy, v'tuv levav, and gladness of heart, merov kol, out of the abundance of all good things. It is a stunning insight. A society that loses the art of happiness is a society on the brink of decline. And that makes happiness a social and, in the broadest possible sense, a political issue. So, I think and let us just chase that for one moment. We'll do it very quickly. What does social happiness entail? First of all, can I just point out one feature of the Bible, which I think is tremendously important? which is that the book of Genesis comes before the book of Exodus. Isn't that interesting? What do I mean? And Christians should see this much more readily than Jews, because in the Christian Bible, the book of Ruth appears before the first book of Samuel, right? And it's very interesting. In the Hebrew Bible, the book of Ruth appears nowhere near the book of Samuel, but the Christian Bible gets it in the chronological order. What is Exodus about? The birth of Israel as a nation. What is the first book of Samuel about? The birth of Israel as a kingdom. They are both political moments. But what is Genesis about? Human relationships. It's about husbands and wives, parents and children, siblings and their rivalry, about Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Rachel and Leah. That's what it's about, personal relationships. The Bible tells us the story of the personal relationship before it begins to talk about the political phenomena of the book of Exodus. Ditto with 1 Samuel, which talks about the birth of Israel's monarchy, first Saul, then David. It tells us the story of Ruth, of the what's the phrase, that lovely phrase? The kindness of strangers, of Ruth's attachment to Naomi and Boaz's kindness to both of them. And right at the end of the book of Ruth comes the punchline that Ruth is, in fact, the great-grandmother of King David, Israel's greatest kings. The Torah is telling us something extremely important: the primacy of the personal over the political. Do not expect to create a happy society simply by political institutions, which of necessity use force, coercive power. That's what politics is about. The primacy of the personal over the political. Okay. Oh, I like that. You have made somebody very happy. Thank you. Okay, that's number one. Number two, a fundamental Jewish distinction, as you know, it follows from this, is that happiness is to be found down here in the here and now, in this world, in this life, in the physical universe that God created and 7 times called God good. It is here in this embodied existence, that wonderful mix, as the Bible calls it, of dust of the earth and breath of God. In other words, Judaism rejects a whole tradition in religion, Gnosticism, Manichaeism, even Platonism, that sharp separation of body and soul, the physical, the spiritual, the time and the eternity, the particular and the universal. Happiness is down here in the particularity of our embodied existence. And it was the late Sidney Morgenbesser, if I'm not mistaken, professor of philosophy at Columbia, who once proved how useless Platonism can be in the real world. You know, Plato's theory of forms, that the reality is not all these particulars down here, it's the form of things up there. He took his philosophy students to a restaurant in the Lower East Side, he called over the waiter and said, "Waiter, I'd like to order soup." So the waiter said, "Yeah, pea soup, chicken soup, we have a wonderful borscht." "None of those," says Morgenbesser, "I just want soup." If you want to drink soup, you've got to drink it in its particularity. You cannot drink the Platonic form of soup. So Judaism is down here in the particularity. That's point 2. Number 3, there is in Judaism, and this, again, very distinctive, a rejection in the Jewish mainstream, not on the borders, but of the voluntary embrace of suffering or poverty. With the exclusion of the Qumran sect, there are no monasteries, no convents in Judaism. There is no virtue of celibacy in Judaism. There are no holy mendicants who give away their wealth and live as paupers. And there are some remarkable statements in Judaism. We have one classic example of a person who does give up something, the Nazarite who forswears wine and all the products of grapes and doesn't have a haircut either. And the Bible says when he comes to the end of his period of Nazariteship, he brings a sin offering. Why does he bring a sin offering? Now, the plain reading of this is obvious. He's bringing a sin offering because he's going from a high state of holiness back into ordinary life. But the rabbis read it exactly the other way around. Why is he bringing a sin offering? For the sin of becoming a Nazirite in the first place. He gave up wine. God created wine. He gives it his personal hechsher sometimes. God created wine for us to enjoy, and this man turns his back on one of God's blessings. So that rejection of rejection is very central to Judaism. And Maimonides says something so profound here. Maimonides, in the Guide of the Perplexed, talks about the perfection of the body and perfection of the soul. The perfection of the body is, creating a society where you can live, earn a living, live in safety. The perfection of the soul is something we all do in the innermost recesses of our own consciousness. And Maimonides, who is a great perfection of the soul guy, says, nonetheless, perfection of the body takes priority because you don't believe that if you're sick or you're hungry or you're homeless, you can think noble thoughts about God. Poverty humiliates. And that is a very Jewish approach, very different from other religions. In order to be able to have the higher spiritual achievements, your basic human needs need to be satisfied. And that's why Judaism, from the very earliest days, and always, throughout all the diaspora, had its own voluntary welfare state, which made sure that no one lived at the extremes of poverty. Then, of course, we have David's point, which is very often life is boring. And it is a matter of taking the kids to school, or it would be if I ever took the kids to school. I learned, I especially learned not to be able to drive in order to, anyway. And here I would say, David, one of the most glorious things of Judaism, it's the way, I call it the poetry of the everyday. When food comes with its aura of sanctity, the whole laws of kashrut, when on Shabbat, you take a simple glass of wine and 2 loaves of bread, and you welcome the divine presence, to share it with you. When you sing a hymn of praise to the woman of the family, when you bless your children, Judaism etches the quotidian with the charisma of sanctity. And that is what we call halakha. It's there in the Bible. It's that way in which we made the home the locus of so many of our important ceremonies and rituals, not the synagogue. And that, I think, the poetry of the everyday is what makes the boring, nonetheless, happy-making. And that's very important. And then I mentioned the Sabbath. This, too, is important for societal happiness. Read the classical writers on Judaism. The Greek and Roman writers who wrote about Judaism were scathing about one institution above all, the Sabbath. They couldn't work out the Sabbath. What is the Sabbath? Jews are lazy. That's what they said. That's it. They couldn't believe. Greeks, everyone knows what is a holy day. Everyone knows that. But a holy day whose holiness consists in the fact that you don't work, that they didn't understand. The Talmud says, and I never checked this, somebody here will know, the Talmud says that when the scholars, in the letter of Aristeas, gathered together those 72 or 70 scholars to translate the Bible into Greek, the Septuagint, they deliberately changed certain sentences that they thought would be unintelligible in Greek. And according to the Gemara and the Megillah, if I'm not mistaken, one of those was the sentence, on the 7th day, God completed the work which he had done. And instead they wrote, on the 6th day. Because they didn't think a Greek could understand that Sabbath is itself a creation. Now, it is interesting that Greece and Rome declined and fell with remarkable rapidity. And Jews and Judaism are still here. And the reason is that just like individuals, civilizations can suffer from burnout. And the Sabbath is the antidote to that. And that is why the Sabbath is societal happiness. at its very best. Go to Jerusalem on a Sabbath morning, breathe the quiet. Understand that on the Sabbath, where there's no working, no shopping, no driving, we're all enjoying God's world on equal terms. Shabbat is civic time, the way a wonderful park is civic space. It's beautiful, and we all enjoy it on equal terms. That is part of societal happiness. Then gratitude. You will know from the famous so-called Nuns Study, which began in the University of Minnesota. I don't know where it began, where it followed up. But this was looking at a number of nuns who at the age of 20 or so had written on their entrance as novitiates their own autobiography in their own words. And 60 years later, they found that those who expressed at the age of 20 the greatest gratitude, thankfulness for life, were the ones who lived longer or longest. And that is one of the great things about religion in general. It teaches you gratitude. I think in one longitudinal study they discovered that people who go regularly to a house of worship live 7 years longer than those who don't. Or as I said to Elaine, maybe it just seems 7 years longer. When a Jew gets up, he or she says a whole litany of blessings. Thank you, God, for giving me back life. Thank you, God, for the cockcrow who woke me up in the morning and I threw something at it. Thank you, God, for when I put my foot down, you create some ground for it to stand on. All the rest of it, everything you can thank God for, we thank God for every day. And that, every item of food, every item of drink, we thank God. We do, it was Heidegger, who's not my favorite person, who said, thinking is thanking. And that is true in Judaism. So there is the gratitude. And then, and all of these things, and then all of those things are embodied in Jewish law, and the result of which is to create what Aaron Lichtenstein calls societal beatitude. I would just add two other elements. One that has become highly significant today with the spread of the angry atheists. You have some in America. We have most of them in Britain, or we exported some to you. We sent you Christopher Hitchens. We kept Richard Dawkins in case we felt lonely. And, you know, the angry atheist, what I call the intellectual equivalent of road rage. Anyway. And the essence of the angry atheists, here we are in a universe that is meaningless. We are an irrelevant speck on a minor third-rate planet, and in case we thought there was anything special about us, Stephen Hawking and et al. Think there are a billion infinity of other parallel universes. We are totally insignificant. We are born, we live, we die, and it is as if we had never been. We are dust on the surface of infinity. At the end of the day, to contemplate the meaninglessness of the universe condemns you to an Epicurean morality. And I don't recommend an Epicurean morality because its lifespan was 1 century. I mean, Epicurus, well, it was revived by Lucretius, but one way or another, a society that has gone Epicurean as a society on the brink of decline. In Judaism, we believe there is meaning. We matter in the scheme of things. That is what Viktor Frankl discovered in Auschwitz, quoting Nietzsche, those who have a why can survive any how. Those who feel a sense of divine presence, a task, a call, a vocation, a mission, can sustain the will to live even at the gates of hell on earth. And that sense of belonging happens with special power in the Abrahamic monotheisms. It begins with God's call to Abraham, and it is there in Maimonides, who codifies the view of the rabbis, that each of us should consider at every moment that the fate of the world will be dependent on how we choose our next action. If there's one thing Abrahamic monotheisms do, it is attach significance to the individual life. And finally, the point at which we really converge with the Dalai Lama, which is hope, that last great dimension of happiness. there is a direct contrast between the Greek concepts of ananke and moira and inexorable fate on the one hand, and the Jewish concepts of freedom, responsibility, repentance, forgiveness on the other. Do we face a closed or open future? Those cultures that believe in inexorable fate write tragedies. They produce a Sophocles and Aeschylus, geniuses, but they write tragedies. Those cultures that believe in choice and forgiveness, they don't even understand the word tragedy. For a people that suffered more than most, you will be surprised to know that in Hebrew there is no word for tragedy. And when modern Hebrew wanted it, it had to borrow tragedia. Why? Because Judaism, and doubtless Christianity likewise, are the principled refutation of tragedy in the name of hope. And that, I think, is the final point of happiness. So I hope I've given you an idea now of three kinds of happiness, three strands in a very complex picture in Judaism. Happiness is struggle. Let's call that prophetic happiness. Number two, happiness is peace. Let's call that wisdom happiness. And happiness as the thing we share, let's call that covenantal happiness. And I think that is enough, at least, to begin a conversation. But let us end by saying, let us have this conversation because it matters. And it matters because only if we know where we want to get in our lives do we stand any chance of getting there. So let me finally end with my favorite story of all time on just this point, and it makes me happy. Here it is. My hero, philosophically, Ludwig Wittgenstein. The late Professor David Dauber, Regius Professor of Roman Law, once told me that Wittgenstein, I told Dauber, he said, what are you doing? I was a student at the time. I said, I'm studying philosophy. Dauber said, terrible thing, philosophy. Philosophers are so, they're so up in the air with their own things, they never know what day of the week it is. It's terrible, give up philosophy immediately. And he told me the following story, that Wittgenstein was standing at the Oxford station waiting for the London train with two of his disciples, H.L.A. Hart, the Professor of Jurisprudence, and Elizabeth Anscombe, and they were so immersed in metaphysical conversation that they entirely failed to notice the train as it steamed into the station, and as people were getting off and so on, and it was only as the train was leaving the station they looked up and they saw the train. And as Dauber told it, Professor Hart ran and heaved himself on board, and Elizabeth Anscombe, an enormous woman, ran and heaved herself on board, and Wittgenstein ran but could not catch up with the train and was standing there as it steamed out of the station. And he was looking so crestfallen that people came up, a lady saw him and took pity on him and said, "Don't worry, there'll be another train in an hour's time." And he looked at her and said, "But you don't understand. They came to see me off." Thank you.
Moreno Harav Harashi, thank you for this wonderful tour of the three modes of happiness in Judaism and many of the byways to which they lead. We have two respondents. Our first respondent, Professor Deborah Lipstadt, needs no introduction to this audience. Again, you will find a biographical sketch in your program. I want to add only that when we invited Deborah to teach at Emory, she had just published Denying the Holocaust, the Growing Assault on Truth and Memory. How could we have known that in a few short years she would become a celebrity as David Irving sued her in a British court of law? The trial, part of which my wife and I were privileged to attend, was historic in its dimensions. Her attorneys obtained a complete vindication of Deborah's work and a no-nonsense condemnation of David Irving and the Deniers. The story of the trial is told in Deborah's book, History on Trial, My Day in Court with David Irving. Deborah has continued her work on Holocaust-related trials. Her book on the setting and impact of the Eichmann trial is in proofs, even as we speak. Deborah and our other respondent, Professor Michael Broyde, will teach a course next semester on the post-Shoah trials and their impact on international and human rights law. Our second respondent, Professor Michael Broyde, also needs no introduction to this audience. You will find a biographical sketch in your program. I want again only to add that biblical rabbinic culture is very largely legal in its self-definition. This seems strange to many Christians, though not so strange to Muslims. Michael has, with great learnedness and vigorous intellect, brought the legal nature of Jewish religion, and indeed of all religions, to the campus of Emory University, teaching courses on Jewish law in addition to his courses in various aspects of American law, serving very actively on rabbinic courts all over the world, and publishing prolifically on a large range of subjects as seen from the point of view of Jewish law. Michael has galvanized the Center for the Study of Law and Religion and turned what some might disparagingly call Jewish legalism into a disciplined area of study within the Emory University School of Law. We are indeed indebted to him for this. I turn the podium over to Professor Lipstadt.
Thank you. Wisdom may be said to be the knowledge of knowing what you know and knowing what you do not know, or do not know well enough upon which to expound. The much quoted this morning Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, put it more succinctly: there's a time to be silent and a time to speak. This morning, I participate in this program with Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. First of all, a personal note that his support and the support of Lady Sachs during those trying days in London and their rejoicing with me afterwards is something I remember very deeply. But those of you who know and have heard Rabbi Sachs yesterday and today, you know that, and those of you who have read his books on Judaism and Jewish theology, to speak of Jewish theology and philosophy in his presence would be extremely full-heartedly, or to use a more philosophical term, the ultimate of chutzpah, audacious in the extreme. So too, my fellow respondent, Professor Michael Broyde, is not only an expert in Jewish law, but a dayan, a judge in a leading rabbinic court. To speak to you of Jewish law, of halakha, in his presence would be equally chutzpahdik, audacious. I have therefore quite logically chosen to look at this topic, the topic of happiness, through the prism of my own area of expertise. Not just Jewish history in general, but more specifically the history of the Holocaust, and within a larger framework, the history of anti-Semitism. It is not so much of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism of which I wish to speak, but of Jews' reaction to them. However, I speak to you also, and cannot avoid doing that, it comes with the territory, as a member of that ubiquitous thing called the Jewish community. Now, some of you may legitimately be wondering if I did not receive the memo that this was a conference on happiness and not on suffering and persecution. Rest assured, I did get the announcement. Having received it, I had cause to ask myself, how and have the Jewish people responded to the terrible traumas we have endured? How should we relate to a history which is replete with suffering? And Rabbi Sachs alluded to some of those things in the beginning of his talk, and his next book, as you heard him say, is going to deal with that. Is there room for happiness? How do we find a balance between remembering suffering and enjoying and seeking happiness? These are such large questions that even if I had a full hour, I could not fully explore them. In the time allotted to me, I wish to briefly explore a trend that I, and I am hardly alone, have discerned in contemporary Jewish life. It more than worries me. It makes me very unhappy. As I told the chief rabbi last week over dinner, a pundit once observed that Jewish life can be analyzed on a spectrum, with joy at one pole and oi at the other pole. Moreover, this pundit continued, when it comes to matters of Jewish identity, many Jews find themselves far more comfortable situated at the oi end. They know it better. It feels more familiar. That does not mean that we do not laugh and laugh at ourselves. We do that exceptionally well. Think the Marx Brothers, Mel Brooks, Woody Allen, Joan Rivers, Billy Crystal, Roseanne Barr, Gilda Radner, or more recently, Larry David, Sacha Baron Cohen, one of your own products, Jerry Seinfeld, Sarah Silverman, and of course, Jon Stewart. But comedy and happiness can be two diametrically opposed matters. In fact, one could argue that many, if not all, of these Jewish comedians have built their careers on being miserable in the unique way that only a Jewish comedian can be. You know, they wake up in the morning, if nothing hurts, they worry. My concern is that when it comes to seeking lessons in Jewish history, there is a tendency among some Jews to highlight the negative, almost to the exclusion of all else. I am not saying, of course, that we should ignore past suffering. Of course not. My entire professional career stands in opposition to that proposition. Nor do I mean to suggest that we should not attempt to draw lessons, many different lessons, from the past in general, and more specifically, from the repeated attempts of the world, most recently in the 20th century, to destroy the Jewish people. The danger comes when we make suffering our raison d'etre. In 1948, when the pain of the Holocaust was still too immediate to even be fully fathomed, the Jewish scholar and founder of the first Jewish studies program in the United States, from which I am a graduate, Simon Ravidovich, published what Leon Wieseltier has aptly called a great retort to pessimism. In his essay, Ravidovich, in his essay called Israel, the Ever-Dying People, Yisrael, Am Holech Vamet, Ravidovich observed that, quote, the world has many images of Israel, but Israel has only one image of itself, that of an expiring people, forever on the verge of ceasing to be. He who studies Jewish history will readily discover that there was hardly a generation in the diaspora period which did not consider itself the final link in Israel's chain. Each always saw before it the abyss ready to swallow it up. Often it seems as if the overwhelming majority of our people go about driven by the panic of being the last, end quote. Because of this pessimistic Weltanschauung, this bleak worldview, no tragedy, Ravidovich argued, could take the Jew by surprise. It saved us from losing our footing. Ravidovich concluded, an ever-dying people is an ever-living people. A nation always on the verge of ceasing to be is a nation that never ceases to be. Ravidovich's erudite essay was somewhat more briefly summarized in a well-known Jewish joke, and I tremble I said I would not speak theology before Rabbi Sachs. I tremble at telling jokes before Rabbi Sachs, because those of us who have known him for a long time, and even you who have just heard him yesterday and today, know that had he not chosen the rabbinate, he could have made a great career in being a stand-up comic. But fools rush in where the wise do not tread. There was a Jewish man, the Jewish joke goes, there was a Jewish man sitting on a train, and he begins to moan, "Oi, am I thirsty? Oi, am I thirsty? Oi, am I thirsty?" And the other person in the compartment couldn't stand it and went to bring him some water, brought him some water, everything was quiet. The man who brought the water thought he could now read in peace, etc. And suddenly, after a few minutes, the man began to moan again. Now, it's a Jewish joke, so it has two endings, and you can choose whichever one you like. The man begins to moan, "Oi, was I thirsty? Oi, was I thirsty?" Or the more pessimistic conclusion, the man begins to moan, "Oi, will I be thirsty? Oi, will I be thirsty?" Both endings validate the man's fears and leave him feeling that he was indeed right. He was thirsty, but he no longer is. But remembering how thirsty he was gives added pleasure to the fact that he is not sated. However, if he ends up being thirsty, he will not be surprised by that occurrence. Fearing the return of his thirst helps him prepare for it and not be taken by surprise. Remembering the past is a crucial thing because it not only prepares you for future occurrences, but allows you to prepare yourself to protect yourself from its impact. That may have been what Moses meant when he taught the Jewish people as he was about to part from them right before his death, Zachor Yemot Olam, remember the days of yore, learn the lessons of the generations that came before you. Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, whom Rabbi Sachs cited, wrote in his book, The 13-Petaled Rose, in an essay on repentance, if you don't know where you have come from, you don't know where you are going. The past is the anchor for the present. Remembering the past, even a terrible and painful past, is crucial. The danger comes when past suffering is instrumentalized and becomes one's reason for being. Knowing of the unhappiness which has infused so much of our history is crucial. Using that unhappiness to encourage a person, particularly but not only a young person, to identify or observe as a Jew is wrong. Too often the fear of anti-Semitism or the memory of the Holocaust has been mobilized to motivate Jews to observe rituals, donate to philanthropic causes, or take a particular political position. As someone who delights in her Jewish identity, I cringe whenever I hear someone suggesting that we should be, do, or maintain our Jewish identity because of anti-Semitism. Doing that is not only a distortion of Jewish history and Judaism, but is counterproductive. What person, what young person, wants to be affiliated with a people who carries aloft a banner upon which is inscribed the downtrodden and the oppressed? This is what the great historian Sela Widemeier Baron called the Lacrimosa theory of Jewish history. Judaism teaches us that rather than because of suffering and oppression, but despite, not because of, but despite, afal pi, despite the best efforts of the world to destroy the Jewish people, we rejoice in who we are. We celebrate the world around us. We find fulfillment in the relationships we build, in the doing of good for others, in the gift of life that we have been given, and in living a life that is worth living. Even as we remember the bleak in our past, we rejoice and find fulfillment in the blessings of the world around us. We attempt to repair that world, and in the quest of so doing, we find osher, fulfillment, or happiness. Thank you.
Chief Rabbi Sachs's accolades to John Witte bring me back to my days as a young man in Yeshiva University. It was a cold winter day. It was in the height of the financial desperation of Yeshiva University in the 1980s, and they had turned the heat in the dormitories off to conserve money. And we trudged off to our morning Talmud class with Rabbi Soloveitchik. 9 in the morning, the steam pipe in the cafeteria had burst, so there was no breakfast. And Rabbi Soloveitchik looked up and said, Yeshiva University is a lot like heaven. An interesting observation. He smiled and said, there's no food, there's no sleep, there's no money, and the scenery is all white. The truth is that Rabbi Sachs's praises of John Witte are extremely important and easy to miss. John has built a law and religion program here that's conducive to happiness, builds scholarship, puts together remarkable colleagues, creates an environment of intellectual stimulation, makes the doing of our job worthwhile. This itself is a central manifestation of what I want to speak about in happiness, which isn't just praises of John Witte, but it forms a theme at some level. Happiness is the problem when happiness is the goal. If the goal is to be and lead a good life, happiness becomes the consequence of that good life, because honorable systems and good places build on the Emory model of happiness and not the models Rabbi Soloveitchik jokingly referred to as yeshiva universities. Happiness derives from and is a consequence of doing the right thing, building a community that encourages others to do the right thing, and facilitates ethical, moral behavior. This makes people and the community of these people happy and content. Of course, I'm not so naive as to think that that's always the case. As Deborah has told us, the Jewish tradition is full of situations of misery that derives from being right. It's not true to say that in the history of the Jewish people, right has always triumphed. We can point to many, many, many situations where might has triumphed and right has suffered. Nonetheless, the rabbis recognized very much in their construct of Jewish law that if you want to encourage people to do the right thing, you do so by creating an environment of happiness and joy. Thus, when it comes to rejoicing at the festivals, an example of Jewish law that I want to focus on in my brief remarks, we understand that the Bible tells us a very peculiar legal mandate. 7 times the Bible says that you should be happy on the festivals. Not you should come to worship God with dour, not that you should come to God's temple in sadness, but that you should be joyful yourself personally as you celebrate the festivals. The rabbis, truth be told, were befuddled by this mandate in the sense that unlike most of Jewish law's mandates, which are do this, or even more commonly, don't do that, here, Jewish law seems to be mandating a state of mind. A state of mind. Now, the rabbis understood that the intent of this happiness was to allow you to worship God properly. After all, if you yourself are unhappy, how can you worship God properly? But yet, it's very hard to mandate happiness. You can wag your finger all the time at people and say, be happy, or as you sometimes say to your own children, shut up and be happy. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And the Bible doesn't say pretend to be happy, act happy. It seems to want that you yourself should genuinely be happy, reflecting, I think, a very important value. The value of the center of the law and religion, which is good works come from happy people in good environments. And the rabbis recognize that if we want Jews to be happy during the festivals, it's because we're going to create an environment of happiness in which people naturally are happy. Their happiness is contagious, and to some extent the contagiousness extends all the way up to heaven. And the happiness of God's children makes God happy also. But the rabbis said, how do you make people happy? It's not by mandating happiness. It's not by wagging your finger at people and saying, be happy. And I think the rabbis put forward 3 models of how to create a good environment in which people naturally are happy and then they proceed to do good. Because although it's possible to do good in bad environments when you yourself are miserable, it is, simply put, more difficult. You can be a good person in a bad place, like Lot was in Sodom, but it's much easier to be a good person in a good place. That's simply more normal and more reflective of the human condition. And the rabbis mandated 3 things on the festivals that I think are generally reflective of the rabbis' understandings of happiness. The first is the simplest, which we mention in passing, but easily overlook. Happiness can't be found when there's physical suffering. Although we're talking here about happiness of the mind, the simple fact is that poverty is not ennobling. It makes life difficult. The rabbis mandated on the festivals that you should take time off from work because most of us not professors, but most of us don't find work to be a continuous source of happiness. They mandated social and legal structures that created calm, ample food, marital intimacy, alcohol even. There is a reason why on Passover we drink 4 cups of wine. Although there's much symbolism associated with the 4 cups of wine, the rabbis recognized that alcohol in reasonable, moderate levels induces happiness. Simple physical happiness is a prerequisite for the kind of deep moral happiness that allows a person to do good without difficulty. So the rabbis frequently said to mandate the kind of deep emotional happiness, what we need to do is we need to start with the baseline of physical happiness. And this is important to us as well. As we go about spreading happiness in the world, you have to realize that eliminating the central obstacle to happiness requires that we uplift the plight of the desperate, because you can mandate spiritual goodness and a life of charity and good deeds for everybody, but it's a null word to people who scrounge every day for their food and shelter. Happiness requires that people have the minimum. The second thing they said is they recognize the need for society to individualize. Different people find happiness in different ways, and the rabbis laid out broad mandates of happiness: eat meat, drink wine. But the rabbis said things like, if you don't like to eat meat, you don't have to. And if alcohol gives you a headache, drink grape juice. There's a recognition of the fact that there is no single secret to the kind of inner contentment that the rabbinic tradition wants you to have so that you can do good. There's a recognition of the fact that to seek this kind of inner contentment, what you need to do is you need to individualize within parameters. If we want a happy society of people who are doing good, it's not because we're each marching in lockstep, seeking happiness in the exact same way. That will not make most of us happy. Thirdly, they recognized there was a balance between community and family. And when you look at the festivals, you see that there's a certain element of all of us getting together in prayer. We go to synagogue and we pray as a group, but we don't eat together as a group. We go back to our homes and our residences, and we seek a different form of individual happiness by ourselves, again, recognizing the fact that some of us are happy in a group, and some of us are happy in a more individual setting. The simple fact is that when you set out to think about models of happiness in the Jewish tradition, we recognize that happiness is a prerequisite to a good life. It's not the good life, but it is a necessary precondition to living the ethical good life. Happiness can't be the goal. It has to be the tool to achieving the goal. But recognizing that it's an important tool and that it's very hard to lead a righteous good life when people are miserable, when you are suffering, is a central mandate of the rabbinic tradition. People need to live a life of individual contentment in order to position themselves properly to do good in this world. Happiness and contentment are merely a goal, are merely a path to a goal, but if you're not on that path, it's very hard to achieve the ultimate goal of living a productive, good, ethical life. Thank you very much.
Well, I think you've heard enough to keep you occupied for a little while. We are going to take questions from the floor. There are 2 microphones. I only ask that you get to the microphone and ask your question. And please, let's try to keep it as a brief question to which we will have brief responses. Yes, ma'am.
The rabbi yesterday said that the two ways to share happiness and a deep connection amongst an interfaith group are to share stories and to share songs. And he's already shared stories with us. And I was wondering if he could share a song with us that we could share in.
Oh, my goodness.
That's a first, huh? Got to be a cantor, too.
With the greatest of pleasure, but first we have to sit around a table with a little Bromfen, schnapps, you know. Look, I'm seriously, you know, I've told the jokes, okay, and I've told the stories. You'll have to let me off the singing till next year, but I promise it works, okay? So next year we'll have a nice round table. We'll all sit together and we'll teach you some songs. If you really want to be happy, do you use? Sorry, I'm one of those people for whom technology is what we have grandchildren for. They could. But I did want to cheer people up about the Middle East and about stuff. So if you go into YouTube, yeah, and key in Oseh Shalom, yeah, he who makes peace, O-S-E-H, space, S-H-A-L-O-M. You will see a little video that I did for YouTube. We composed a piece of music very specially.
Nice.
It was orchestrated by one of the world's great record producers, Trevor Horn. Next month, I think, we'll hit the 1 million hits, and it has made almost 1 million people very happy. So it's the one with lots of children on it, and you'll see me there. Oseh Shalom, it will give you 4 minutes of musical happiness. I promise you.
Yes.
I wonder if you would comment on the role of seeking joy within the Hasidic tradition and the larger Jewish tradition.
The Hasidic tradition is built on the idea of serving God with joy. And I think it's been one of the most glorious things of Jewish life in recent centuries. There was a danger, and there is today again, there was a danger in the 18th century, and there is today in the 21st century a danger that Judaism produces a scholarly elite who study Talmud all the time and whose connection with the vast majority of Jews is limited, even, God forbid, patronizing. And the Hasidic movement took joy as a way of connecting everyone, whatever your intellectual level, whatever your economic level, and they serve God with joy. And so this is an internal Jewish remark. I am a lapsed Litvak. I come from that intellectual tradition, but I'm proud to say I'm today Hasidic because I love serving God with joy.
Yes, sir, please.
What about the role of mysticism in Judaism as a way of bringing happiness in life?
There is a very rich mystical tradition, some of which really touches other mystical traditions, not least Sufism. You have a whole meditation tradition of the great Spanish Jewish mystic Abraham Abulafia, a meditative tradition. There's a lovely introductory book on this by the late Aryeh Kaplan called Jewish Meditation. And mysticism has also very much been associated with a certain kind of joy in Judaism, which I would call the yearning of love. We have in Judaism tended to import mysticism into the mainstream, what one Jewish thinker once called normal mysticism. And we do this most specifically on Friday evening in terms of a service called Kabbalat Shabbat, which, in other words, welcoming the Sabbath, which was developed among the 16th century Jewish mystics in Tzfat in northern Israel. And there are these two beautiful mystical songs, the Chododi and Yedid Nefesh, one by Shlomo Alkabetz, one by Eliyahu Azikri. which are full of mystical longing. So the mystical tradition is an elite and esoteric tradition, but it was brought into the mainstream, especially on the Sabbath, at the beginning of the Sabbath, and then again towards the end of what we call the third Sabbath meal, the Su'udah Shlishit. And those are kind of mystical moments set within the Jewish week, and they were thereby brought mainstream. Yeah.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.